The last 3 decades have seen a rise of critical interest in the issues of travel, gender, and politics in women-authored travel narratives across the centuries in different national traditions. A lot has been written on 19th century European women travelers, but critics have actually largely neglected French women travelers of the interwar era. My book project, therefore, seeks to fill this important gap in French and Francophone studies by showing how French women's particular position within gender and racial hierarchies sheds new light on colonial discourses of the Third Republic. More specifically, I call for a rethinking of colonial epistemology from the material and discursive standpoint of women by uncovering a large body of texts previously unknown or forgotten. This allows me to disrupt the categories of center and periphery by showing how French female writers, ethnographers, and journalists of the interwar years appended colonial hierarchies from their marginalized subject positions as women. I propose contributions to at least 2 distinct fields in my project, post-colonial cultural studies and mobility studies. First, my work adds nuance to colonial power discourses in a particular sociocultural context by highlighting their contradictions. What does this mean? So a novel or travel narrative is not the same thing as a pamphlet or a promotional text, and it is not an illustration of ideology. If, historically, women writers need to go through complex negotiations with traditional hierarchies and gender representations, these travel authors nonetheless communicate their own perspective on things seen on their journeys to French colonies. Frequently not content with writing in a neutral way, as a so-called objective observer is expected to do, or unhappy about writing as a woman should do by restricting herself to the domestic realm, these authors powerfully affirm their gender identity, which becomes for them a privileged vantage point from which they can narrate their lived experience in West Africa, Indochina, and the French Caribbean, and construct their identity on their own terms. Secondly, my project contributes to the field of mobility studies. I examine in my book a vast corpus of texts, newly read or reread, which allows us to relativize a certain number of preconceptions about travel writing and mobility studies more generally, mobility more generally. While critical studies conceive of the activity of travel as liberating, one that allows the traveler to construct their own identity differently away from the European center, the texts of my corpus show that travel often leads the author protagonist to a kind of ossification of identity and a feeling of unease. This is what happens, for instance, in the works of one writer, Magdalene Wautier, who, at the end of her narrative, states that she wants to return to France because she finds Africa too exotic and its inhabitants too different, to the point that they appear diametrically opposed to Europeans. Here, travel does not lead the author to an open-mindedness about the world at large, but on the contrary, reassures her of familiar categories and confronts her prejudice. So a bit of cultural context within which I'm working. In the first quarter of the 20th century, as I show, French colonial possessions were undergoing unprecedented expansion, culminating in the normalization of the colonial idea through the promotion of its different facets among the French metropolitan public. By the beginning of the century, colonies came to be defined as an extension of the French metropole, places of peace and tranquility, constituting a greater France that metropolitans could not only visit for pleasure, but to which they could also potentially emigrate. Around the same time, the role of French women in the empire-building project that I examine went through a massive shift in the way it was conceptualized. Promotional literature, whose goal was to encourage women's migration to the colonies, created a discursive identity known as a coloniale, whose facets I examine closely and which, at the time of its creation, embodied an ideal of imperial citizenship for women preparing to move overseas. The processes of colonial settlement and expansion, the promotion of the feminine civilizing mission, as well as their general modernization taking place in the West, all had important consequences for feminine mobility as it related to the colonial space, which was now deemed to be suitable for women. Female-authored colonial travel writing became a popular genre, with the literary market of the interwar years being flooded with travel narratives by women, both professional writers and journalists, as well as amateurs. A few examples are the journalists Titaina and Marie Choisy, or the Orientalist scholar adventurer Alexandra David-Nil. While women travel authors taking trips to the French colonies were not all colonial themselves, in as much as they traveled alone and didn't always make the journey with the intention to stay, They nonetheless negotiated with the discursive identity due to gender role expectations, as I show in my book. Despite the proliferation of women-authored travelogues in the interwar years, writing a travel narrative set in the colonies was by no means a direct consequence of the journey. On the symbolic level, French colonial possessions were still conceived of as a masculine space. Theorists of the so-called colonial literature and the authors of promotional texts advised women to share their colonial experiences in travel texts and novels. However, the authors were supposed to cast themselves in conventional feminine roles and promote the domestic French values that they were presumed to uphold. Critics praised such texts and their authors for putting their creativity to use for a noble cause, while also relegating them to a marginal place within the literary landscape. Women who went beyond documenting a feminine experience, as I show, wanting to express their individual voice, like a male author could do, were often barely noticed, if at all published, like most authors of my primary corpus. My work, therefore, has broad theoretical implications for understanding the complex relations between French Republican ideals, Francophone literatures and cultures, and gender dynamics in the 20th and 21st centuries. It allows me to interrogate the centrality of male figures who were not necessarily central at all, such as André Gide or André Malraux, for defining the poetics of the adventure novel in the interwar years and the genre of travel writing of the first half of the 20th century. And I'm doing this by uncovering a large body of texts that were forgotten, that were unknown. So a lot of archival research has gone into this project. Furthermore, by examining the prerequisites for success on the interwar literary market and marginalization practices in the field of colonial and post-colonial writing, my project permits to situate canonical authors of the time, early 20th century authors such as Colette, or contemporary French authors such as Marie Khabarovskiy, in regard to the literary heritage of French colonialism and the question of gender. Thank you so much for your attention.